She ran at 4:47 every morning, not because the base fitness regulations required it, not because some doctor had told her cardio would help with the sleep. She ran because running was the only time her mind went quiet enough to count. 41 steps from the barracks gate to the first fence post, 93 to the corner where the floodlight buzzed, 217 to the water. Elena Reeves had memorized the perimeter of Naval Station Norfolk in 11 days, not the official layout from the contractor orientation packet. The real layout, the gaps between patrol intervals, the camera blind spots, the three places where the fence met the asphalt at an angle that would make it easy to slide through in the dark, if a person ever needed to. She did not need to, that was not the point. The point was that she could not stop doing it. The Atlantic air hit her face cold and salt sharp as she turned south along the waterfront. December in Norfolk, the sky still black except for a thin gray line forming over the bay. She could see the shapes of ships at the piers, massive and silent, and she did the same thing she did every morning without thinking about it. She counted them. 1 destroyer. 2. A supply vessel she hadn't seen before, moored at Pier 7 instead of its usual spot. New arrival overnight, she filed it away. Her left wrist ached. It always ached in the cold. The shrapnel had gone in at an angle just below the radius bone, and the scar tissue had never fully softened. The doctors at Landstuhl had done good work, but tissue memory was a stubborn thing. Cold weather reminded her of the compound. The compound reminded her of the 8 men. She slowed to a walk when she reached the end of the pier road, stood there, listened. A ship's horn from somewhere out in the bay, long and low, and the sound moved through the dark and touched something inside her chest that she had learned to leave alone. It was the same sound, almost exactly, that she remembered from a damaged radio handset in a second-floor room in Kandahar. The static breaking apart, and then suddenly, impossibly, a signal cutting through. The sound that meant someone was coming. The sound that meant she had done it. She had not known their names. That was the thing that had stayed with her. 8 men evacuated from that compound, and she had not known a single name. She had seen their faces for less than 30 seconds as the helicopters took them out. One of them had looked back. His mouth moved, but the rotors took the sound away before it reached her, and then they were gone. And she was alone in the compound with a wound in her left arm and 37 images on a camera she had not been authorized to use. She had learned their names afterward, all 8. It had taken her 4 months working around the classification walls, using the small professional network she still had after leaving the agency. She had found photographs, deployment records, a few news articles from hometown papers that mentioned their service in passing. She had written the names in a notebook she kept in a fireproof lockbox under her bed. She looked at the tattoo on her wrist now. 8 small marks, 1 for each man. She had added them one by one as she found each name. The design around them had come first, a gift from people who trusted her more than she had deserved, but the 8 marks were hers alone. Nobody knew what they meant. Nobody had ever asked. She turned and ran back toward the base. She had work to do. The Intelligence Analysis Division occupied the 3rd floor of Building 4, a concrete structure that smelled permanently of burnt coffee and recycled air. Elena had been assigned a workstation near the far wall, which she had chosen specifically because it gave her sight lines to both entry points and the window that faced the parking lot. The analyst who had previously sat there had left a motivational poster taped above the monitor. She had taken it down on her first day and put it in the supply room without comment. By 06:30, she was already 3 reports deep into the morning's intelligence product. Intercepted communications from a network operating across 3 countries. She read differently than the other analysts. Most of them started with the summary. Elena started with the anomalies, the places where the language shifted register, where a word choice didn't fit the supposed author, where the syntax stuttered in a way that suggested translation from thought patterns that hadn't started in Arabic. She kept a yellow legal pad beside her keyboard. Not for notes the way other people took notes. She drew maps, organizational structures, communication webs, the kind of things that were easier to see as shapes than as data. She had been doing this for 6 months at NSN, and she was good at it. She knew she was good at it. What she could not always control was whether the people who received her analysis understood what they were reading. Lieutenant Commander Price stopped by her desk at 07:45, the way he did most mornings, holding his coffee in both hands, the way men did when they wanted to appear relaxed. He was 34 years old, had done 1 deployment, and had the specific confidence of someone who had never been genuinely afraid in a professional context. He was not unkind, he simply did not understand what he did not know. "The Syria report looks good," he said, "clean." "The Syria report has a structural problem on page 9. She did not look up. The communication cell they're describing as independent has a response time that's too fast for independence. They're getting external cueing. I've noted it in the annex. Right. He glanced at the legal beside her keyboard, a web of nodes and connecting lines densely annotated. You always draw those by hand? Yes. Interesting. He walked away. She went back to the report. Here was the thing she had learned about being invisible in a place like this. It was not unpleasant, exactly. It was functional. The analysts who got noticed were the ones whose analysis turned out to be wrong at a critical moment, or the ones who lobbied for attention in the briefing room. Elena did neither. She produced reports that were accurate and thorough and annotated, and she submitted them through the correct channels, and she watched them disappear into the institutional machinery. And occasionally, weeks later, she would read an operational summary that contained a specific phrase or tactical assessment that she had written first. No attribution, no acknowledgement. That was fine. She was not here for acknowledgement. She was here because this was the only kind of work that let her stay connected to the mission without going back to the place where the mission had almost finished her. At 9:30, she had a briefing to give. The conference room on the second floor had a whiteboard, a ceiling projector that required manual focusing, and 10 chairs around a table that could fit 12. Elena arrived 7 minutes early. She set up her materials. She checked the door. She positioned herself so that she was facing the entry when people came in. 3 junior officers filed in and took seats. Lieutenant Commander Price arrived and sat at the head of the table with his notepad. A 4th officer she didn't recognize came in and sat down without introduction. And then, near the end of the settling in period, a man appeared in the doorway who was not any of those things. He was tall, middle to late 30s, with the particular physical stillness of someone trained to make themselves less visible in a room than their size would normally allow. His face carried the kind of weathering that came from years outdoors in harsh environments. Not the gym variety, but the real kind, sun damage and wind lines and a small scar near his left temple that was old enough to have gone white. He wore a standard working uniform with no unit patch that she could immediately read from across the room. He scanned the room the way she scanned rooms. She noticed that immediately. He took the chair nearest the door. Not the most prominent seat, not the worst seat, the seat with the best exit angle and a full view of everyone else at the table. Elena began her briefing. She had given this type of presentation more times than she could count. She knew how to structure it for different audiences, how to lead with operational relevance and follow with the analytical basis, how to make complex pattern analysis accessible without losing its precision. She kept her voice level and her pace measured, and she used the whiteboard the way she always did, not as a slideshow, but as a working document she built in real time as she spoke. The junior officers were attentive in the way people were attentive when they knew they might be tested on the material. The lieutenant commander took notes. The man by the door did not take notes. He watched her hands. Specifically, he watched her left hand every time she raised it to write on the board. She could feel it the way you feel a draft from a window you can't see. Not intrusive, precise. He was looking for something specific, and every time she moved her left arm, he was checking whether he'd found it. She did not pull her sleeve down. She let him look. About 12 minutes into the briefing, she paused to let a point settle, and Petty Officer First Class Marcus Webb, the intelligence specialist she had been told would be attached to the incoming SEAL team, asked her a question about signal architecture in the network she described. It was a sophisticated question, more sophisticated than his rank suggested, and it was phrased in a way that would have been difficult to answer without direct field experience. Webb was testing her. She stepped to the whiteboard. She began to draw, not a diagram from a slide deck or a schematic from a manual, from memory. She built the network node by node, marking communication tiers, annotating timing windows, noting the specific frequency cycling pattern that she had first observed not in an intelligence report, but in the field. 23 nodes, 7 tiers of command structure, 4 communication methods in rotation. She worked without hesitation and without reference. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. When she finished, she set down the marker and looked at Webb. The pattern I just drew, I first saw it operational in 2019. Not in a report, in a compound. She paused one beat. Does that answer your question? Webb did not respond immediately. He looked at the board, then he looked at her. The man by the door had gone very still. Senior Chief Ray Kowalski found her in the hallway after the briefing. She had not met him formally. He had come in late, taken a position near the back where she could hear him but not easily see him, and she had followed him as SEAL Team medic based on the way he carried himself and the specific way he had watched the junior officers in the room. 18 years of service, minimum. The kind of man who read people the way she read documents. He was 40-something, built heavy across the shoulders, with close-cropped gray at his temples and the steady, unhurried manner of someone who had been in enough emergencies to know that panic was a choice. He fell into step beside her without introducing himself. "You watch the exits first," he said, not an accusation, an observation. She kept walking. Habit. Only one kind of habit makes a person do that in a conference room on a Navy base. She didn't answer. "Good briefing." He peeled off toward the stairwell without another word. She continued to her desk and sat down and opened the next report in her queue, and did not think about the man by the door who had watched her left hand, or the senior chief who had noticed what she noticed, or the way the room had gone quiet when she drew from memory. She put all of it in the same place she put everything that wasn't immediately actionable, in the back part of her mind where things were organized but not examined, accessible but not consuming. She had learned to do this over 3 years of being the wrong person in the wrong room. She read until noon. The afternoon brought a second briefing, a joint session with the incoming SEAL team for their area of operations orientation. Elena had prepared more extensively for this one. She knew who was coming. She had read what she could access about the team's recent operational history, and she had tailored the intelligence product accordingly, moving the focus away from broad network analysis and toward the specific tactical patterns most relevant to their deployment window. She arrived first, set up, checked the exits, took her position. They filed in together, and there was a quality to the way a SEAL team entered a room that she had only encountered a handful of times in her career but never forgot. It wasn't theatrical. It was the absence of theater. 8 men with a total absence of performance, each one occupying exactly as much space as necessary, and no more. Each pair of eyes doing a rapid environmental assessment before the chair was even pulled out. They moved like a system, not like individuals. She recognized Webb from the morning session. She identified Kowalski from his build in the way he sat, slightly angled from the table, better for quick exit. The others she assessed and filed in sequence. The man from the morning was last through the door. His name tag read Holt. She read it in the first 2 seconds and then returned her eyes to the room as a whole. He took the same seat as before, nearest the door, best exit angle, full field of view. She began. This briefing was different, not because the material was different, though it was more operational, but because the audience was different. These men did not need persuading that the information was real. They understood at a cellular level the difference between desk analysis and field-verified intelligence. And they were listening to her now not as an academic exercise, but as a survival calculation. Every number she gave them, every pattern she described, every vulnerability she assessed in the enemy's communication structure went directly into the part of their minds that would be running quietly in the background when they were on the ground and things were not going according to plan. She had sat in the rooms on the other side of that equation. She knew what was at stake in a briefing like this one. Halfway through, she was describing insertion timing windows when she became aware, without looking, that Holt had leaned forward slightly in his chair. Not because the information had changed. She hadn't changed anything. It was because he had made a decision, and the decision had moved through his body before it reached whatever part of him was still evaluating it. She kept talking. When she finished and opened the floor for questions, he did not raise his hand. He said, "Miss Reeves, would you mind rolling up your left sleeve?" The room went silent. Not the polite silence of a question being processed. The absolute silence of every person in the room understanding simultaneously that something important had just happened, that the ordinary protocols of a base briefing had been set aside, and that nobody knew yet whether that was dangerous or necessary. She looked at him. He met her eyes, and what she saw there was not what she had expected. She had expected recognition, the warmth of it, the uncomplicated version. What she saw instead was something harder and more complicated. The expression of a man who had been carrying something for 3 years and had just found the person he had been carrying it for, and was not sure whether he was grateful or angry about it. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she reached across with her right hand, gripped the cuff of her left sleeve, and pulled it back to the elbow. The tattoo was small. To most people, it would have looked like an abstract design, a few geometric elements that might have been decorative, the kind of things someone got in their mid-20s when they thought they were being interesting. There was a trident at the center, reduced to its simplest form, and around it a series of small elements that were specific in a way that required context to understand. The SEALs understood the context. Webb stood up. He did not say anything. He just stood up. Kowalski made a sound that was very quiet, a short exhale, controlled, the sound of a man receiving information that changed the shape of something he had thought he understood. Holt did not stand. He stayed exactly where he was, leaning slightly forward, hands flat on the table. He looked at the tattoo for a long time. Then he looked at her face. 3 years, he said. His voice was low enough that only she was certain of the words. You were right there, in the same building, same hallways, and you never said a word. He stood up. He walked out of the room. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Kowalski moved to where she was standing, and the other SEALs shifted and reconfigured the way people did when a moment had passed and they needed to determine how to exist in what came after it. Webb stepped closer and looked at the tattoo and then looked at her face. Kandahar, Webb said. It was not a question. She said nothing. Kowalski put his hand on her shoulder. One brief, firm pressure. The way a medic established presence with someone who had been through something significant. Give him a minute, he said. She knew that already. She had known before Holt left the room what he needed. She had known for 3 years that if she ever encountered someone from that team, the first thing they would feel would not be what anyone would expect. The gratitude had always been there, she understood that. But gratitude was complicated when it lived alongside 3 years of not knowing who to direct it at. She pulled her sleeve back down. They found her on the waterfront after dinner. Not all of them. Kowalski, Webb, and 2 others. A man named Diaz who moved like he'd been shot at recently enough to still feel it, and a younger SEAL who hadn't spoken during either briefing and seemed to be evaluating everything at a permanent 10-second delay, as if he needed to translate experience into certainty before committing to any position. They walked with her without asking permission to do so, which she respected. Nobody performed the conversation. They fell into a pace alongside her, and Kowalski began talking the way men of his age and experience talked when they were making something real, not filling silence, but placing information carefully, one piece at a time. He told her that the team had known someone got them out of Kandahar. They had known it was a woman. CIA. They had not been able to get a name. He told her the junior SEAL on his left had a daughter who had been born 6 weeks after Kandahar, and that the man named Diaz had gone home and married the woman he'd been putting off proposing to for 2 years, because Kandahar had clarified certain things. She listened to all of it. She did not speak. Then Kowalski said, "What do you call her?" He nodded toward her left wrist, the tattoo. "What does it mean to you?" She thought about the notebook and the fireproof lockbox, the 4 months of searching, the names collected one by one from hometown papers and deployment records, and the small, specific dignity of knowing who you had fought to bring home, even if they never knew you were the one who did it. "The marks," she said. "There are 8 of them, one for each person." The younger SEAL made a sound she could not fully categorize. Not sadness, exactly. Recognition. She did not explain further. She did not tell them about the notebook. Some things were not meant to be shared, not because they were shameful, but because they were complete, because they had been made whole in the privacy of the making, and sharing them would not add anything, would only redistribute them, and redistribution was not what they needed. They walked until they reached the end of the waterfront road and stopped there, looking out at the bay. Webb had been quiet for most of the walk. She had noticed him processing in the particular way that intelligent young men processed when they had encountered information that required significant restructuring of an existing model. He had the specific look of someone reorganizing. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 6 months. "And nobody knew?" "Nobody asked the right questions," she said, "and I didn't offer." Kowalski smiled at that, the first real smile she had seen from him. She was about to say something further when Holt appeared. He came from the direction of the piers, walking with the unhurried directness that she had noticed in the briefing room, and the others registered his arrival and quietly redistributed themselves, moving a few steps away in the natural way that people made space when a conversation needed to occur between 2 specific people. He stopped in front of her. She waited. "I owe you a conversation," he said. "You don't owe me anything. I walked out of your briefing." The line of his jaw was tight. Not anger, she understood now. Something that had been anger once and had spent 3 years becoming something else. "That wasn't about you. It was about—" He stopped. "I know what it was about," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. The wind off the bay moved between them. "Why are you here?" he finally said. "A person with your background could be anywhere. You could be running assets out of a forward operating base somewhere. You could be training officers. Instead, you're doing pattern analysis in Building 4 at Naval Station Norfolk." He paused. Why? She had been asked variations of this question by herself, mostly in the early morning hours when the running didn't quiet her mind the way it was supposed to. She had never given herself a fully satisfying answer. "Because I can't go back to the field," she said. "Not yet, maybe not ever. And I can't go back to civilian life because civilian life doesn't have any of this in it." She gestured at the bay, the ships, the base. "So this is the middle ground." Holt was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter. "That's not a place," he said. "That's a waiting room." She looked at him. There was something precisely correct about that, and she did not know what to do with his precision. "Maybe," she said. "What are you waiting for?" She didn't answer, not because she was avoiding the question, because she genuinely did not know, and she had enough respect for him and for the question not to manufacture an answer. They stood there in the December cold, with the bay making its dark sounds around them, and after a while Holt reached out and shook her hand. Not the soft gesture of introduction. Firm, brief. The kind of handshake that meant something was being acknowledged that didn't have words. Then he nodded once and walked back the way he had come. She watched him go. Behind her, she could hear Kowalski saying something quietly to the others, and the sound of them beginning to move, dispersing back toward quarters. And she turned to look at the water one more time and let the cold settle into her bones for a moment before she turned to follow. She had not been waiting, she thought. That was not the right word for it. She was maintaining readiness for something she could not yet name. Her phone showed a message at 22:47 hours. She had been asleep for maybe 90 minutes, which was more than usual, and the buzz of the phone pulled her up through the layers of sleep the way she had trained herself to come up. Alert first, oriented second, reaching for the phone third, because understanding context before acting was the thing that kept people alive. The message was from an internal base system. No sender name, classified routing. Reeves, Elena C. Report Admiral Carvero's office 0600. Bring all current intelligence files on Middle East network activity. Bring nothing else. This message will not appear in standard communication logs. She read it twice. Then she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time. She knew the name. Rear Admiral Susan Carver, NAVCIN Intelligence Director. She had seen the name in routing headers and distribution lists, the kind of name that appeared at the top of chains of authority and rarely came down to the working level. Carver was the kind of person whose office you did not receive an 2247 message from directing you to arrive at 0600. Unless you were not, in fact, a civilian contractor who had stumbled into a moment of recognition at a briefing. Unless whoever had looked at the situation and understood its full dimensions had decided that the moment for careful distance was over. She lay back down, did not close her eyes. The pain in her left wrist had settled to its usual background presence. She pressed her thumb against the tattoo in the dark, feeling the slightly raised texture of the ink. 8 marks, 8 names. The photographs she had taken on a camera she had not been authorized to use, in a compound she should have left before the situation required her to stay. 37 images. She had kept them for 3 years in a place that no one could access without knowing exactly where to look. She had not used them because using them without the right moment, without the right supporting architecture, would have been worse than not using them at all. It would have been a shot in the dark. One voice against an institution that had every incentive to discredit the voice. She had been waiting for someone to pull on the same thread from the other direction. She did not know yet whether Admiral Carver was that person or something else entirely. At 500, she rose and ran. 41 steps to the first fence post, 93 to the corner, 217 to the water. She counted every one of them. She was ready. Admiral Carver's outer office was managed by a lieutenant who had the particular focused efficiency of someone who understood exactly how important their role was and performed it accordingly. The room was clean and austere, decorated with the framed photographs and service commendations that marked decades of dedicated institutional presence. The outer office felt like the anteroom to a decision of consequence, which Elena had learned from experience was usually the accurate read. She was announced at exactly 600. The inner office was larger than expected, with a window facing the bay that framed the morning light in a way that was either deliberate or lucky, and Elena had spent enough time in the intelligence world to know that senior officers at Carver's level did not rely on luck for the details of their environment. Admiral Susan Carver stood at the window with her back to the room. 60 years old or close to it, silver hair cut short and precise. The kind of posture that came not from rigidity, but from 40 years of having made decisions that mattered and carrying them correctly. She did not turn immediately when Elena entered, which was itself a kind of message. When she turned, her eyes went directly to Elena's face, not to her rank insignia, which she didn't have, not to her contractor badge, to her face. "Ms. Reeves," she said. Her voice had the specific quality of someone who never said more than was necessary. "Thank you for coming." Admiral Carver moved to the desk and sat down. She did not gesture to the chair across from her immediately. She picked up a single sheet of paper from the desk and looked at it for a moment, as if reviewing a calculation she had already made but wanted to verify. Then she set it down and looked at Elena. "Someone is selling Kandahar," she said. The words landed in the room without drama. No preamble, no context setting, just the fact placed between them. Elena said nothing. Intercepted communications, originating from a network operating across Malaysia and the Philippines. The level of operational detail they have is not possible from open source intelligence or standard intelligence reporting. Carver's voice did not change a register. This information came from someone who was there, or from someone who had complete access to the classified after-action record. How many people had full access? Elena asked. 17. Carver picked up the sheet of paper and set it on the desk facing Elena. A list of names. 8 SEALs, 4 CIA operatives, including yourself, 3 military intelligence officers who provided support functions, and 2 senior commanders who authorized the operation. Elena looked at the list. She did not touch it. Her own name was on it. You're investigating everyone on this list, she said. I am, including me. Yes. Elena found this reasonable. She would have done the same thing. There's something else, Carver said. She opened a drawer in her desk and removed a second document, this one with a classification header that Elena recognized as several levels above what her current contractor clearance should have been able to access. The file that documents your specific actions during the Kandahar operation. The file that would have, under any normal accounting, resulted in a commendation. Possibly several. She placed the document on the desk. It was thin, much too thin. It doesn't exist anymore, Carver said. I deleted it. The temperature in the room did not change. The light from the bay window continued its steady morning presence. Elena kept her face still and her hands at her sides and let the words pass through her without attaching to anything on their way. Why, she said. It was not a question with an upward inflection. It was a question with no inflection at all. Carver looked at her for a long moment. The expression on her face was the expression of someone who had made a calculation 3 years ago and was now arriving at the place where that calculation met its consequences. Because of what you found in that compound before the evacuation, Carver said. What you found on the Taliban commander's laptop. If that information became attached to your official record, it would create a chain of inquiry that would lead to questions I was not prepared to answer. She paused. 3 years ago, I was not prepared. I chose to eliminate the attachment point. You erased me, Elena said, to keep yourself clean. Carver did not look away. Yes. The bay outside the window was doing what it always did, moving, unhurried. Why are you telling me this now? Elena asked. Because I need you, Carver said. Not the contractor, the operative, the person who built a communication network under fire and got 8 men out of a compound that should have killed everyone in it. She leaned forward slightly. I need the person who photographs things she shouldn't be photographing and keeps them somewhere I can't find for 3 years. I need that person to find this leak before whoever is behind it reaches the full content of what you saw on that laptop. She paused. Because if they reach it, Carver said, and then stopped. The silence extended. Elena understood that Carver had stopped, not because she was hesitating, but because she was measuring, assessing what the next sentence would do to the space between them. Because if they reach it, Carver finally said, the leak will not be the worst thing that happens this week. Elena looked at the list of 17 names on the desk. She looked at the window. She looked at Carver. And for the first time in 6 months, she felt the waiting room recede. She knew what came next. She had always known what came next. She had just been waiting for someone to open the door. Building 12 sat at the southeastern edge of Naval Station Norfolk's restricted administrative complex, separated from the main intelligence division by 2 security checkpoints, in a corridor that required separate badge authorization at every door. It had no windows on the ground floor. The ventilation system ran louder than it needed to, which was either a design flaw or a feature, depending on how you thought about the nature of the conversations that happened inside. Elena arrived at 5:45 the morning after Carver's briefing, 20 minutes before anyone else was scheduled. She did this deliberately. She needed to see the room before the room saw her. She needed to understand the space, the furniture, positions, the sight lines from each workstation, which monitors faced which direction, where the cameras were, and what they covered. She needed to know which chair was closest to which exit and which terminal had the best unobstructed view of the door. These were the things you learned in the first 10 minutes, or you spent the rest of the operation catching up. The facility was a single large room divided by function. Along the north wall, 4 dedicated intelligence terminals with classified network access, each one requiring individual biometric authorization and a rotating daily pin. Along the east wall, a signals monitoring station with 8 radio channels running simultaneously and a direct feed from the NSA's regional intercept hub, a setup that would have cost more than most people made in a decade and ran 24 hours a day whether anyone was listening or not. In the center, a long conference table with laptop positions for 4 analysts, built-in power and encrypted data ports at each station. At the south end, a whiteboard that ran the full width of the wall, clean and unmarked, which meant nobody had worked in this room recently, which told her the investigation had been kept tightly compartmentalized, which told her Carver had been careful. She stood in the center of the room and turned a slow circle. The camera in the northwest corner had a 40-degree field of view that covered the entry door and the central table. There was a blind spot at the east wall behind the signal station, about 6 feet of floor space that the camera could not reach. She noted it without emphasis and continued her assessment. Then she went to the whiteboard and picked up a marker and began to draw. She built the network from the outside in, starting with the known terminal nodes and working back toward the center, the way you approached a minefield, mapping what was visible before guessing at what was buried. 20 minutes of uninterrupted work produced a diagram that covered most of the board's left side, annotated in her own shorthand, a system she had developed over 8 years that looked like random notation to anyone who hadn't been trained to read it. By the time the first sounds of arrival reached her through the corridor, she had identified 3 anomalies in the network's communication pattern that she had not been able to see from her workstation in Building 4, anomalies that only became visible when you stood back far enough from the individual data points to see the shape they made together. Holt came in first. He came in without ceremony, without the social preamble that most people used when entering a shared workspace for the first time, and he assessed the room the same way she had assessed it, though faster and with the particular systematic efficiency of someone trained to evaluate tactical environments under time pressure. His eyes went to the exits first, then the table, then the whiteboard. He looked at what she had drawn for a long moment, reading it with visible concentration. Then he looked at her, said nothing, pulled out the chair at the terminal nearest the door and sat down. Kowalski came in behind him. Senior Chief Ray Kowalski moved the way experienced medics moved in uncertain environments, with a physical awareness of space that was not aggression but readiness, the body perpetually updated on who was where and what the distance was. He was 42 years old and had the face of a man who had seen people at their worst and had continued caring for them anyway, which was a specific kind of resilience that showed up in the lines around the eyes. He looked at the whiteboard, looked at Elena, gave a small nod that meant something she could not fully translate but received as respect. Webb came in behind Kowalski. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Webb, 29 years old, with the particular quality of focused intelligence that Elena had identified in the briefing room on the first day. He sat down at the signal station and began running a routine equipment check with practiced efficiency, fingers moving through the sequence without needing to think about it. He was good at the work. She had known that immediately. What she was still assessing was the depth and direction of the intelligence behind the competence. Petty Officer Diaz followed, moving with the careful economy of someone who had been shot at recently enough to still be factoring the memory into every physical adjustment. Not limping, just precise. The kind of precision that came from learning that the body was expensive and movement cost something. He was 31 years old and had the eyes of someone 10 years older. Last through the door was Teller, the youngest member of the team, 26, with the watchful quietness of someone who understood that the way to learn in a room like this was to absorb completely before contributing anything. He sat in the chair farthest from the whiteboard and did not ask questions and did not fill silence, which Elena found promising. The people who filled silence in rooms like this one were the people who weren't listening carefully enough. Nobody pulled rank, nobody made a speech about procedure or jurisdiction. They understood what the room was for. They sat down and started working. Carver had been precise about the operational parameters. The investigation was compartmentalized to this team and this room. No outside personnel, no routine reporting channels. They had full access to the signals intelligence product from the past 8 months, authority to cross-reference any database in the NavCen intelligence architecture, and a direct line to Carver's office that they were to use only when they had something definitive. The implication was clear. Bring her a name, not a theory. Elena had been in rooms like this before, in different buildings, in different parts of the world. Rooms where the ordinary rules of institutional hierarchy dissolved in favor of function. And what mattered was not what you wore on your collar, but what you could do when the information stopped making sense. She had always operated better in those rooms. Rank told you where people stood in the official structure. Competence told you what they could do when the official structure broke down. She preferred the second information. She turned from the whiteboard and looked at the group assembled at the table. The communications they're using don't read like terrorist traffic, she said. I've been tracking this network for 4 months, and I've been wrong about something fundamental the whole time. The language in these intercepts doesn't originate with the network. It was written for the network by someone who thinks in American military doctrine. She paused to let that land. We're looking for an instructor, not an infiltrator. Webb leaned forward in his chair. His eyes moved across the whiteboard map with the same reading speed she used herself, picking up annotations, tracing connections, processing the diagram as a living argument rather than a static picture. You said instructor, someone who provided this network with a template, not just raw intelligence, a framework for using that intelligence operationally. The way they describe entry and exit timing, the way they reference overwatch positions, the way they think about layered communication security and redundant fallback protocols. She tapped a section of the board. That's not self-taught, that's trained. Someone sat with these people, or with their direct handlers, and taught them how to think about operations the way American Special Operations thinks about operations. Holt looked at the board from across the table. The set of his jaw was the same as it had been in the briefing room, that particular configuration she was learning to read as controlled deliberation rather than suppressed anger. That narrows the pool considerably. It narrows the type, she said. Someone who has trained either special operations forces or intelligence personnel at a tactical level, who understands not just the what of American operational planning, but the how and the why. All 17 people on Carver's list fit that description. So we need a secondary filter. She drew a vertical line down the center of the whiteboard, dividing it into two columns. On the left, she wrote timing. On the right, she wrote access. Every leak event we can identify corresponds to a briefing or a distribution. What I've been looking at since 0500 this morning is the precise timing of those events relative to when briefings were scheduled and when distribution notifications went out. She turned back to face them. The leaks don't happen after the briefings. They happen before, sometimes by as little as 3 hours, which means our person is not getting the briefing content from the briefing itself. They are getting access to the briefing schedule before the content is finalized. Kowalski sat very still. That's a different kind of access. It is, and it's a much smaller pool. Scheduling access for classified intelligence briefings at this command level routes through approximately 6 people in the base administrative chain. She picked up a second marker. Cross-reference that with the original 17. We get 4 names. She wrote them on the board. Diaz read the names from left to right, and when he reached the third name, his right hand, which had been resting open on the table, closed slightly. Not a fist. A partial grip, involuntary. The kind of physical response that ran through the body before the conscious mind decided whether to allow it. It lasted less than a second. Then his hand was open again and his face was composed. Kowalski had seen it. Elena had seen Kowalski see it. The third name on the board was Colonel Frank Aldridge, Defense Intelligence Agency. She pulled Aldridge's service record from the classified database at 0830 and read it at her terminal with the systematic attention she brought to everything. Not skimming for highlights, but reading the full document as a constructed narrative that both revealed and concealed information depending on how you approached it. 25 years of service, Defense Intelligence Agency, senior officer designation, 3 overseas postings, 2 in the same regional theater that had produced the Kandahar operation. His fitness reports read like a series of carefully maintained hedges, praising his analytical judgment and his collegial relationships and his ability to manage complex interagency coordination, the language of a man who had learned precisely what belonged in official documents and precisely what did not. No disciplinary flags, no financial irregularities in the most recent security review, which had been conducted 18 months prior, predating the period of active leaks by 6 months. On paper, Colonel Frank Aldridge was exactly the kind of man who should have been the last person on any suspect list. She had spent enough years in the intelligence world to understand precisely what that meant. The people who looked cleanest had either never done anything wrong or had learned thoroughly how to manage the appearance of not having done anything wrong. The distinction was not always legible from the outside. Webb appeared at her shoulder without announcement. He had the quality of someone who moved quietly not because he was trying to be undetected, but because quiet movement was simply his default state, the physical expression of a mind that preferred observation to projection. He looked at the screen for a moment without speaking. He supervised the intelligence analysis for the Kandahar operation, Webb said, quietly enough that the conversation stayed between them. I know. He would have had complete access, not just the operational file, the planning documents, the target assessment chain, the authorization records. I know. Webb was quiet for a beat, a thinking beat, not a hesitation beat. There was a difference and she had learned to read it. His travel records for the past 8 months. I pulled them this morning. 3 trips to the Pacific Theater, 1 to the Gulf. All of them fall within 72 hours of significant leak events. She turned and looked at him. He had done this analysis independently, she understood. He had arrived this morning with the preliminary work already developed, which meant he had been thinking about this before today. She filed that observation and said nothing about it. Bring me the full travel record, she said. He brought it in 4 minutes. She spread the documents across the table and looked at them as a pattern problem, as a question of shape and interval and deviation from baseline. Aldridge moved frequently, which was not unusual for a senior DIA officer whose portfolio covered multiple regional theaters. What was worth examining was the rhythm. He was not using the standard 30-day TDY cycles that senior officers typically favored. He moved in compressed windows, arriving and departing within 24 to 48 hours, rarely staying long enough to generate a substantial paper trail at the destination. Clean, tight, low visibility. The kind of travel pattern that was either completely innocent or had been carefully managed to look so. She looked at it for 7 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up at Holt. "I need to put something in front of Aldridge directly," she said. "I need to watch him receive information and see what he does with it." Holt leaned back in his chair. The back legs creaked slightly under the shift of his weight. "We don't have authority to surveil a senior DIA officer without flagging it to Carver first." "I'm not going to surveil him," she said. "I'm going to talk to him." He looked at her for a long moment with that deliberative expression, the rapid probability calculation she was becoming familiar with, the assessment of risk against necessity that was the fundamental cognitive operation of someone who had spent his career making decisions where the cost of error was measured in lives. "What are you going to tell him?" he asked. "Something slightly wrong," she said. "Something small enough that the error is invisible to anyone who doesn't know the true version. And specific enough that when the wrong version appears somewhere it shouldn't, I know exactly where it came from." Kowalski looked up from his terminal. "Canary trap. Each person on the list gets a different version of the same piece of information. A location, a coordinate set, a timing window, small but trackable variations in each version. When the wrong version appears in an intercept, I know who the source is." She paused. "But I'm going to start with Aldridge in person because I want to see his face when he receives it." Teller, who had not spoken once since arriving in the room, looked up from his screen. He did not say anything, but he was listening with the full-body attention of someone storing everything. She called Aldridge's office at 0930, using the internal base directory, and requested a professional consultation on the DIA's regional threat assessment documentation, a document she had legitimate analytical reason to discuss, and which would give her 30 uninterrupted minutes with him without triggering any administrative flags. He agreed without hesitation, confirmed the time, said he had been looking forward to meeting her, which was a strange thing to say and which she filed immediately. His office was on the second floor of the base administrative building, standard senior officer configuration, 2 entry points, shared wall with an empty conference room. She noted these things in the seconds after she walked through the door. His desk was positioned with its back to the window, blocking natural light in favor of controlling what he could be seen against, either a long-standing preference or a habit developed in environments where sitting with light behind you was a disadvantage. The room was orderly with the excessive precision of someone controlling the surfaces of their environment because other things in their life were not currently controllable. Every document stacked exactly. Every pen parallel to the desk edge. The particular neatness of sustained internal pressure. Aldridge himself was 52 years old, lean across the shoulders in the way that men who had been athletic in their 30s stayed lean into their 50s, with gray at his temples and a face that had been shaped by decisions rather than just by experience, which was a different kind of aging. He rose when she entered and shook her hand with the practiced courtesy of someone who had spent 2 decades in rooms where first impressions were operational data. His eyes went to her face, then to her left wrist, then back to her face. The sequence took less than 1 second. She had seen that sequence once before, in a briefing room, from a man who had spent 3 years looking for a specific tattoo on a specific wrist. Aldridge had just completed the same visual check with the same practiced speed that came from knowing precisely what to look for. He knew about the tattoo. He had been told what to look for. She did not let any of this show in her face. She sat down and opened the threat assessment documents and began working through the consultation she had scheduled, asking the kind of careful questions a competent analyst asked, receiving the kind of careful answers a senior intelligence officer gave, the entire surface of the conversation running on exactly the tracks it was supposed to run on, while she maintained a second layer of observation beneath the official layer, watching the small physical data that people manage poorly under sustained stress. His hands, the way his breathing shifted when specific subjects came up, the micro adjustments of his posture when a question touched something he was actively managing. She collected these signals the way a doctor collected symptoms, building a picture from accumulation rather than from any single indicator. 12 minutes in, she mentioned casually that a communication node she had been monitoring appeared to have shifted to a new position north of its previously assessed location. She gave him specific coordinates, a precise timing window for anticipated activity. She kept it embedded in the flow of the broader conversation, Nothing remarkable about it. Just one analyst sharing a working detail with another professional. His left hand, which had been resting open on the desk, closed slightly. Not a fist, a partial grip. The involuntary muscle response of someone whose body registered information as significant before the conscious mind had processed it and made a decision about reaction. It lasted approximately half a second. Then his hand was open and he was nodding in the measured way of a professional receiving a routine update. She finished the consultation at the scheduled time, thanked him for the documentation access, shook his hand at the door. His grip was firm and his face was composed, and he said it had been useful, which it had been, though not in the way he meant. In the corridor, walking back toward Building 12, she let the distance from his office accumulate before she began processing what she had seen. She did not rush this. Rushing the processing of observed data led to premature conclusions, and premature conclusions in her line of work had consequences that were difficult to correct. By the time she reached the facility, she had what she needed. She sat down at the table and wrote 5 coordinate sets on a fresh sheet of paper, one for each name on the shortened list. She introduced the variations carefully, each set with a single distinct element that made it traceable to a specific source while appearing plausible to a recipient who didn't know the true version. She assigned each set to a name, sealed each in a separate folder. Then she wrote a 5th variation and set it aside separately, unassigned. She looked at it for a moment, then she put it in her secure container. The morning after she distributed the canary trap information, Kowalski arrived at Building 12 before the rest of the team and sat down beside her without being invited. She had come to understand this as his particular mode of delivering information he had decided mattered. No preamble, no positioning, just the information placed directly in front of the person who needed it. "Webb asked me 3 times about your background yesterday," he said. His voice was level and unhurried. Different context, different framing across the day. The questions sounded friendly. She kept her eyes on her terminal screen. And? The first question was genuine. He was learning something. The second question was checking what he'd learned against something he already believed. The third question was shaped differently, came from a different conversational angle, but was designed to produce the same answer as the first question, with a slight variation that would tell him whether the answer was consistent or whether I was managing what I said. He paused. "That's not curiosity, that's technique." "What did you tell him?" "A different answer each time. Small variations, consistent enough to pass casual scrutiny, but with traceable differences." He looked at his hands on the table. He didn't react to the variations. She turned from the screen and looked at Kowalski directly. The morning light from the ventilation panel above them was flat and even, and it made his face look clear and still. "Which means he already had the correct version," she said, "and he wasn't verifying the facts. He was assessing whether you were a reliable source or a managed one." That was my read. She thought about Webb in the briefing room on day 1. The speed of his comprehension, the specific shape of his questions, the way he had pulled Aldridge's travel records before being asked. The pattern of a man who had arrived at this investigation with significant prior work already done and was managing how much of that prior work to display. "When you gave him the wrong answer the 3rd time," she said, "what specifically did you say?" He told her. She listened to all of it without expression. "Did he push back on the wrong answer?" "No." "Did he ask a clarifying follow-up?" "No, because he already had the correct answer from a source he trusted more than you," she said. "He wasn't trying to acquire information from you. He was running a test to see how much you knew and how you managed what you knew." She turned back to her terminal. "Thank you, Ray." He stood from the chair. At the door, he stopped without turning around. "How long have you suspected him? That something was calibrated differently about him?" "Since day 1. She paused. "That it was specifically and definitively him?" "Since about 20 minutes ago." He nodded once and walked out. She pulled up the signals intercept feed for the past 18 hours and began to read with patient attention, looking for the specific frequency signature that would correspond to the variation she had assigned to Webb's folder. She was looking for the wrong answer in the right place. She had set 4 traps. She did not know yet which one would fire first. She settled in and waited with the quality of stillness she had developed over years of doing exactly this, sitting in rooms and waiting for the world to tell her something she already partially knew. The confirmation arrived at 17:43 hours. It came through the automated monitoring system as a flagged anomaly in the regional intercept feed, a transmission from a source node that corresponded to the network she had been tracking, containing a location reference that should not have existed in any legitimate intelligence product. The coordinates in the transmission were not identical to what she had given Webb. They were corrected. They were adjusted by a specific delta that indicated the false element had been identified and replaced with the true value. The original false element she had seeded was Webb's version. She read the intercept 3 times, systematically without rushing. Then she sat with her hands flat on the desk and looked at the wall and let the full understanding of it move through her, because this was the kind of information that required space, that could not be processed at the surface and then acted on without the processing being done all the way down. She had learned this the hard way in the early years, when the pressure to act quickly had occasionally caused her to act on a partial understanding, and the partiality had cost things that could not be recovered. She gave it 90 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and sent 2 words to Holt. His office. Now. She told him in under 3 minutes, laying out the canary trap design, the 5 variations, the precise correspondence between Webb's assigned version and the element that had been corrected in the intercepted transmission. She presented it the way she always presented evidence, in sequence, with full attribution, no editorializing, no conclusions stated before the evidence warranted them. Holt listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet with the particular quality of quiet that was not the absence of thought, but the active management of something difficult. The process of bringing a hard piece of information into alignment with a professional obligation that required it to be handled correctly, regardless of its personal dimension. Aldridge, he finally said. The canary trap also went to him. And to 2 others. Webb's confirmation doesn't clear Aldridge. It's possible the architecture is layered, that Aldridge is the primary source and Webb is a secondary channel, that they're operating in parallel without each other's knowledge. She kept her voice level. The intercept tells me who transmitted my specific seeded information. It doesn't tell me the full architecture of what has been moving for 8 months. His jaw worked once, the motion of a man containing something that wanted a different kind of expression. Webb's been with this team for 2 years. I know. He's been in every pre-deployment briefing, every sensitive planning session. He stopped. Every operational detail we've discussed in this building. I know. He stood from the chair and walked to the narrow window at the end of the room. Outside, the December base was running its evening routine without reference to what was happening inside. Vehicles moving through the dusk, lights coming on in the administrative buildings, the institutional normalcy of a military installation that had no way of knowing one of its investigations had just turned inside out. He stood at the window for a while. "What do you need?" he said, with his back to her. "I need to be alone in the facility tonight. I need Webb to believe nothing has changed. I need the team's normal schedule tomorrow morning so that when he walks through that door at 0600, he has no reason to adjust his behavior." She paused. "And I need you to trust me on the how." He turned. "You're going to bait him. I'm going to create a condition," she said, "and see who responds to it." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he gave the small nod she had learned to read as his version of a green light, the minimal gesture of a man who communicated consent through the absence of objection. She left his office and walked back toward a Building 12 in the December cold, past the waterfront where she ran every morning, past the pier where she stood and counted ships, and she felt something she had not felt in 6 months that she could not immediately name. It took her most of the walk to identify it. It was clarity, the particular clarity that came when all the variables of a complex problem finally resolved into a shape you could act on. She had spent 6 months in the waiting room. She was done waiting. At 21:15 hours, Elena returned to Building 12. She sat at the central terminal and worked steadily, building the secondary analytical layer she had been developing in the background since morning, tracking the timing sequences that underpinned everything she now believed about the architecture of the leak. The work was real. She was genuinely analyzing. But she was also doing something else, and the something else was the more important thing. At 22:01 hours, she stood and walked to the maintenance conduit panel on the north wall, behind the secondary filing cabinet that was never used because the important documents were all electronic. She had identified this panel on her first morning in the facility during the 10 minutes of environmental assessment that she conducted in every new working space she occupied. It accessed the building's primary electrical routing and the facility backup systems. She opened the panel. She made 2 adjustments, precise and deliberate, the kind of adjustments that cut primary power while bypassing the emergency lighting circuit but disabling the backup generator sequence. The cameras would go dark, the ventilation would stop, the electronic locks would default to manual operation. The room would go completely dark. She closed the panel, walked back to her chair, sat down with her hands flat on the desk. The lights went out at 22:18 hours exactly. She sat in the full dark without moving. Her breathing was even. Her pulse was measured in the way that pulse could be measured when you had trained it to respond to genuine threat rather than ambient anxiety. The building around her settled into its nighttime sounds, the distant traffic from the exterior gate, The far sounds of harbor activity from the water, the small ticking adjustments of a structure responding to temperature change as the heating system shut down. She counted options in the dark the way she counted steps on the perimeter road. Paramos. Methodically, completely, not to find the right one immediately, but to know all of them before she needed to choose. The door opened at 22:31 hours. A single figure, moving with a flashlight held low, the beam directed at the floor, used for navigation rather than search. Someone who knew the room's layout well enough not to need to look for the furniture. Someone who had not come to find her specifically, but had anticipated the possibility that she might be present and had prepared for that contingency. The figure moved to the central table without hesitation. Set something down, a folder. Reached for the flashlight to bring it up. She spoke before the beam reached her. Turn on the light all the way, she said. I can see you from here. The beam came up fully. It found her sitting at the terminal, exactly where she had been sitting when she killed the power, hands flat on the desk, expression neutral, as if the darkness had been a brief inconvenience she had waited out rather than a condition she had deliberately created. Webb looked at her for a long moment. He did not run. He did not reach for anything. He stood in the beam of his own flashlight with an expression she had not anticipated, which was not fear or the tight-jawed composure of someone managing fear, but something that looked with unsettling precision like relief. You knew I was coming, he said. I turned off the lights, she said. The silence lasted exactly long enough for him to trace what that meant back to its origin. You cut the power, he said, 2 hours ago, through a maintenance access that bypasses the standard work order channel. I have been sitting here since. She looked at the folder on the table. Open it. Show me what you brought. He opened the folder and spread its contents across the table without rushing, laying each document flat with the care of someone presenting evidence rather than producing it under pressure. She watched from her position without moving toward the table, letting him complete the arrangement before she approached. The habit of receiving information in uncertain environments was to see all of it before touching any of it. What he had brought was not what she had expected, not simply the confirmation that her seeded information had traveled from his access point to the network. He had brought her the full transmission chain, the original signal she had introduced, the precise pathway it had taken through the facility's network, and the point at which it had been intercepted and modified before reaching its destination. A correction layer she had not known existed. Someone had seen her false coordinate, identified it as false, substituted a true value, and passed the corrected version onto the network. Someone had cleaned up her trap before it could fire in the direction she intended. She walked to the table and read the full document without speaking. Below the transmission record was a second document showing the correction pathway in detail, including the originating terminal identifier for the correction. She read the identifier. The terminal was not Webb's. It was not any terminal assigned to the operational team. It was an administrative access workstation in Building 12's system, a general-use terminal that any base contractor with appropriate clearance could access. The kind of terminal that should not have been generating classified outbound traffic. She straightened from the documents and looked at Webb. You didn't send the corrected version, she said. I intercepted it, outbound, flagged it because the terminal of origin was wrong. He reached into the folder and produced a second set of documents. There's more. She waited. My brother was James Webb, Petty Officer First Class, SEAL Team 5. He was killed in action in 2018 on a classified mission in the Gulf Theater. The mission was subsequently denied by the relevant command authority. My family received no casualty notification, no formal honors, no official explanation. The mission did not exist, according to every record I was permitted to access. He placed the documents on the table. I've spent 4 years trying to find out what happened and who authorized it. She looked at the documents, an email chain spanning 4 years. Internal communications from what appeared to be the DIA operational planning chain. She read with the speed and thoroughness she brought to every document, and she did not speak until she had read every line. The target package that sent his team to the wrong location, she said, built on intelligence that originated from a post-operation assessment following the Kandahar compound mission in 2019. His voice carried the flat evenness of someone who had processed his grief past the acute phase and into the settled, operational form that allowed him to continue functioning. The assessment identified a target in the Gulf Theater. The coordinates were wrong. My brother's team inserted at the wrong location. The ambush was waiting there. The team that was supposed to be there was not. She set the email chain down. You've been building a case, she said. For 4 years, I applied for this posting specifically. I requested attachment to Holt's team specifically because I knew this investigation would eventually surface the Kandahar connection, and when it did, I needed to be in the room. He met her eyes. I wasn't selling information. I was collecting it. The transmissions attributed to me in the intercept record are me receiving information from a network contact I developed independently to trace the correction chain back to its source. She looked at the transmission record again. Incoming, not outgoing. She had read it as outgoing because of the direction of the identifier in the automated flag system. She had been working from an assumption she had not examined. She set that aside and continued. The authorization chain, she said, the one that sent your brother's team to the wrong coordinates. Who signed it? Webb reached into the folder one final time and placed a single sheet on the table. An authorization memo. DIA classification header. The operational summary of the post-Kandahar assessment that had become the basis for the Gulf target package. At the bottom, the authorizing signature, clean and forward-leaning. The penmanship of someone who had been signing consequential documents for decades. Rear Admiral Susan Carver. Elena looked at the signature for a long time. She looked at it without expression, without the surface changes that most people produced when receiving information that fundamentally restructured what they were doing. She held the face still while the interior reorganized, and she processed the restructuring inward while the outward remained manageable. This was not coldness. It was the discipline of someone who understood that visible emotional response in a room with another person gave that person information she had not chosen to share. She walked to the whiteboard. She picked up the black marker. She wrote 4 words in the center of the clean white surface, large enough to read from anywhere in the room. She needed you blind. She stood back and looked at what she had written. The whole investigation, she said, and her voice had the quality of a person thinking out loud rather than performing a conclusion, working through the calculation in real time rather than presenting its result. Carver brought me in because I'm the only person still operational who can connect her to the laptop in that Kandahar compound. She needed to understand what I retained from that night, what I had preserved and where. She needed to know whether I would surface it during an investigation or whether I would stay managed. She paused. By making me the investigator, she put herself in the position of controlling what I looked at, what resources I had access to, what intelligence came into this room. She could watch every thread I pulled. And she controlled who else was in the room, Webb said quietly. She controlled the team composition. She controlled the access parameters. She controlled the flow of intelligence we were permitted to query. Elena looked at the authorization memo on the table. And while I was focused on Aldridge and the leak architecture, she was quietly managing the evidentiary trail that connects her to your brother's mission and to Kandahar, using this investigation as cover for the management. She looked at the 4 words on the whiteboard. Webb was looking at them too. Aldridge, he said, he's still part of this. He is, but the correction layer changes the picture. He's been feeding the network, but selectively, and someone has been correcting his errors before the information reaches its destination. Someone who needs the network to receive accurate intelligence because the intelligence serves a specific purpose. She thought about the partial grip of his hand when she had given him the false coordinate, the way his eyes had tracked her wrist on the first day, the excessive neatness of his office, the quality of a man managing a sustained impossible situation with whatever tools he still had. Aldridge knows he's compromised. He has been trying to manage the damage while protecting something, or someone, Webb said. He reached into the folder one final time, a single printed page from a campus security incident report. George Mason University. A young woman, 19 years old, reported missing by her dormitory resident assistant. Case status open, treated as voluntary absence despite evidence inconsistent with that classification. Date of the report, 8 months ago, almost to the day. Emily Aldridge. The room felt different after Elena read the name. Not smaller, denser. The way a space felt when the problem it contained finally reached its actual dimensions. 8 months, she said. 8 months is exactly when the most sensitive material started moving, Webb said. She stood with the incident report in her hands for a moment. Then she set it down on the table beside the authorization memo, in the email chain, in the transmission record. And she looked at the 4 documents together the way she looked at network maps, as a shape problem, as the question of what connected things that appeared to be separate. Aldridge's daughter had been taken to Forces Cooperation. The intelligence he had been providing had been corrected by someone with access to this facility's classified network. The authorization chain for the operation that had killed Webb's brother traced back to Carver. Carver had brought Elena into the investigation not to find the leak, but to manage what Elena knew and might eventually surface. 4 documents, 1 shape. She needed you blind. Outside the building at the east end of the quarter, she heard footsteps. Multiple, moving with the measured, coordinated pace of people executing a procedure rather than simply going somewhere. She had memorized the sound of base security on a directed approach in her second week at Norfolk. The cadence was unmistakable. She had not expected to recognize it from the inside of the building being approached. 6 personnel minimum. Moving toward Building 12's main entrance, she looked at Webb. His face was still. He had heard it too. Is there anything on this base right now that falls outside Carver's command authority? She said. He thought for exactly 3 seconds. Not hesitation, a search. The submarine pens, Dock 7, Sublant Operational Authority. It doesn't route through NavCent command structure. She was already gathering materials from the desk. The secure container, the folder, the authorization memo, the canary trap record. She moved without rushing, taking only what was necessary and irreplaceable, leaving everything else exactly as it was. Aldridge, she said, where is he right now? Quarters. He hasn't left the base since your meeting this morning. She made the decision in the span of one complete breath. We need him with us tonight, she said. He has a piece of this that neither of us has, and we have pieces that he's been waiting for someone to put in front of him. He's been alone with this for 8 months, and no one has given him a reason to trust that there was another way. She looked at the door. The footsteps were less than 30 seconds from the entry. And I need Holt. She pulled out her phone and sent one word to Holt. Dock 7. Then she moved toward the east wall, toward the signal station, toward the 6 feet of floor space behind it that the northwest camera had never been able to cover, where a secondary maintenance access conduit had been fitted with a basic mechanical latch, because it was rated as a maintenance ingress point rather than a security threshold. Large enough for a person moving with deliberate care. She moved with deliberate care. Webb followed without being asked, which was the right response. The main door of Building 12 opened behind them as Elena came out through the maintenance access into the cold December air on the building's eastern side. Through the thin exterior wall, she could hear the security team's lights and voices moving through the facility, sweeping across the terminal screens, across the central table, across the whiteboard at the south end of the room with its 4 words in black marker that nobody on that security team had been authorized to read. She did not look back. She moved at a pace fast enough to be purposeful and controlled enough to look authorized. Along the waterfront path that ran toward the submarine pens, toward Dock 7, toward the part of the base that operated under a different authority and where the architecture of the trap that Carver had been building for 3 years did not quite reach. The cold hit her face fully when she cleared the building line and moved into the open space between the administrative complex and the water. December in Norfolk. The bay was black and moving in the dark, and the shapes of ships at anchor were visible as the absence of stars rather than as shapes themselves. Negative space defined by what was not there. She pressed her thumb against the tattoo on her left wrist as she walked. 8 marks. She had pressed it this way thousands of times over 3 years. The physical act of accessing what she carried, the equivalent of checking that something important was still in place. She understood now, completely and without residue, that she had never been in a waiting room. She had been in position. The 37 photographs she had taken on an unauthorized camera in a compound in Kandahar were not a liability she had been protecting herself from. They were a weapon she had been waiting to use correctly. She had understood this at some level from the beginning, that the right moment mattered more than the first opportunity, that a single voice against an institution that had every incentive to discredit it was not enough, that she needed someone to pull on the same thread from the other direction before her evidence could mean what it needed to mean. She had that now. She had Webb's chain of documentation. She had Aldridge's 8 months of managed intelligence, which was itself a record of the coercion. And she had the 37 photographs, which she had kept for 3 years in a place that no one could access without knowing exactly where to look, waiting for exactly this alignment. The lights at Dock 7 appeared ahead of her. Holt was already there, standing at the access gate with the quiet directness of a man who had received a single word and moved on it without requiring explanation. He looked at her face when she reached him, then at Webb behind her. How bad? He asked. Bad enough that we need Aldridge in the next 20 minutes, she said. And then we need to move faster than Carver expects us to be able to move. He held her gaze for a moment with the same expression he had worn on the waterfront when he had told her that what she was living in was not a place but a waiting room. She watched him recognize that something in her had changed, that the person standing at this gate was not the same person who had been sitting in a corner seat in Building 4 being invisible. Then let's move, he said. She walked through the gate. She was done waiting. She had always been done waiting. She just hadn't had everything she needed until right now. The submarine pens at Dock 7 were the oldest structures on the Norfolk waterfront, built in the early 1960s and reinforced twice since. Massive concrete forms that smelled of salt and rust and the particular mineral cold of deep water. At this hour, past 2300, they were staffed by a skeleton crew under Sublant authority, which meant Rear Admiral Susan Carver's Reach stopped at the gate Elena had just walked through. That was the only fact that mattered right now. Holt moved them inside the perimeter without ceremony, using his operational clearance to bring the group through the secondary access point that bypassed the main gatehouse. He had not asked questions beyond the 2 words he had spoken at the gate. He had looked at Elena's face and made his calculation and moved. That was the quality she had come to rely on in him across the past several days, each one of which had felt considerably longer than a day. The space they found inside was a maintenance bay adjacent to the primary pen, a concrete room with strip lighting and the constant background sound of water moving against the hull of a Los Angeles-class submarine moored 40 feet away. It was cold in the way that structures near deep water were cold, a cold that came up through the floor and settled in the bones rather than descending from the air. Holt pulled a folding table from a wall rack and set it up without comment. Webb laid out the documents. Aldridge arrived 11 minutes after the text Holt had sent him. He came through the access point with the gait of a man who had spent 8 months waiting for a particular conversation and had simply resolved at some point between receiving the message and arriving at this room to stop pretending he was doing anything else. He was not surprised to see Elena. He was not surprised to see Webb. He stood in the doorway of the maintenance bay and looked at the documents spread across the folding table, and his face did the thing that faces do when a long internal reckoning finally finds its external form. He sat down. He looked at the table for a long moment, the concrete floor, the documents Webb had arranged in sequence. He looked at them the way a person looked at the physical evidence of a conclusion they had already reached internally, verifying the external shape against the internal one to see whether they matched. They matched. He looked at Elena. "You know about Emily?" he said. "Yes." The word was all she gave him. She had learned that in moments like this one, the person who needed to speak had to be given the space to start. If she filled the space first, she would get his response to her words rather than the thing he had been holding back for 8 months. She needed the unmediated version, the version that had not been processed through anticipation of her reaction. Holt stood near the door. Webb stood near the documents. The maintenance bay held the 4 of them in its cold concrete quiet, the submarine's hull audible as a presence through the far wall, the whole structure oriented around water it could not see. He looked at his hands, then he began. His daughter had been approached 2 weeks before she disappeared, not taken suddenly. Approached. A man near the George Mason campus had made conversation, had seemed harmless, had over the course of 3 separate encounters managed to establish enough rapport that when Emily mentioned to her father she had met someone interesting near school, Aldridge had not initially been alarmed. He had been distracted. He had been deep in a DIA assessment that was consuming his professional attention, and he had told himself he would follow up with her that weekend, and that weekend the call had come instead. A voice he did not recognize, his daughter in the background, saying his name once and then nothing else. The voice had been precise about what it wanted. It had been precise about what would happen if Aldridge contacted law enforcement or his chain of command. It had been precise about the timeline and the quantities of intelligence it expected and the channel through which it would receive delivery. Aldridge had spent the first 2 weeks trying to find a way out that did not require compliance. He spent them understanding that there was no such way. He was a DIA senior officer with 25 years of experience in how these operations worked, and he understood better than most people that the network behind this call was not making empty threats, and that his daughter was not a bargaining chip being held loosely. He had complied. He had also from the beginning, and with the cold, methodical discipline of someone who had spent a career in intelligence operations and had no other tool remaining, begun managing the compliance in the only direction he could manage it. He fed them what they asked for, but he fed them versions that contained enough structural truth to be plausible and enough carefully placed error to degrade their operational utility. He had been doing this for 8 months, watching for any sign that the errors were being caught, telling himself that if the errors were accepted, he was buying time, and that time was the only currency he had left. The errors had not been accepted. They had been corrected. He had known for 6 weeks that someone was cleaning up his work, that someone with access to classified networks was reviewing his output before it reached the network and replacing the false elements with true ones. He had not known who. He had not known from where. He had continued because stopping would have meant Emily's death. And continuing with the corrections in place meant the damage was real and growing, and he was responsible for it. And he had been living inside that impossible mathematics for 6 weeks with no visible exit. "I knew when you came to my office," he said. "I knew what you were doing with the coordinate. I knew what the false version meant." He paused. "I let it fire." Elena looked at him. "You wanted to be caught." "I wanted someone to have enough to act on." He looked at Webb. "I didn't know about your brother. I'm telling you that directly. I didn't know what the intelligence I provided was being used to authorize. If I had known, he stopped. The sentence did not have an ending that satisfied him, and he was honest enough not to manufacture one. Webb looked at Aldridge for a long moment. His face had the expression of a man deciding, in real time, what a piece of information was worth and what it changed. The calculation took several seconds. Then he nodded once, a small motion, the gesture of someone setting something down rather than putting it away permanently. Elena placed the authorization memo on the table in front of Aldridge, Carver's signature at the bottom. He looked at it. He did not pick it up. "She's the correction layer," Elena said. "She has been monitoring the channel you were using to deliver intelligence. When your errors came through, she accessed the network from an administrative terminal in Building 12 and corrected them before they reached the recipients." Aldridge was quiet for a moment. She needed the network to receive accurate intelligence, because the network is providing cover for something larger. The operational disruption the leaks create, the joint exercise threat, the pressure it puts on command authority, all of it has been creating conditions that allow Carver to redirect resources and attention away from her own exposure. Elena paused. "And by bringing me in to investigate, she kept the person with the most damaging evidence about her focused on a problem she had designed specifically to consume that focus." Aldridge looked at the memo again. He looked at Carver's signature with the expression of someone reviewing a decision they had trusted that had turned out to be differently shaped than it appeared. "She has the photographs," Holt said. It was the first time he had spoken since the room assembled, and he said it with the directness of someone who had been listening to all of it and had identified the load-bearing element. He looked at Elena. "She knows you have them. She knows they exist. She's been working toward them since she brought you in." Elena said, "Yes." "Where are they?" The room went quiet with a quality different from the earlier silence. This was the silence of people who understood that the next piece of information was the one everything else depended on. Elena looked at the table. She looked at the documents, the canary trap record, the authorization memo, Webb's email chain, the Campy incident report with Emily Aldridge's name on it. She looked at Holt and at Webb and at Aldridge with his hands flat on the table and his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had been holding something impossible for 8 months and was beginning to understand that he might be allowed to set it down. 3 years ago, before the evacuation at Kandahar, I photographed the contents of a Taliban commander's laptop using a camera I had no authorization to carry into that compound. 37 images. The laptop contained an authorization chain for a joint intelligence operation. American intelligence personnel were named in that chain. The operation had resulted in the deaths of 3 Afghan intelligence officers at coordinates that had been deliberately falsified. She paused. One of the authorizing signatures was Carver's. She reached into the secure container she had brought from Building 12. She removed a folded sheet of paper. She placed it on the table in front of Aldridge. "That's the access location, a secure server in the office of the Inspector General's Digital Evidence Repository. Not in the DIA system, not in any NAVCENT accessible database. Submitted through an anonymous filing system the OIG uses for whistleblower evidence. It has been sitting there for 3 years under a case file that has not been opened because it was filed without a trigger complaint attached." She looked at Webb. "Your documentation of the authorization chain connecting Carver to your brother's mission is the trigger complaint." Webb was very still. "Your brother's mission and the 3 Afghan officers killed at falsified coordinates are connected by the same authorization pattern from the same source," Elena said. "The OIG evidence, combined with your documentation, creates a chain that cannot be administratively managed. It goes to the Department of Defense Inspector General directly. It bypasses every command structure that Carver has access to. It cannot be recalled, and it cannot be deleted. It cannot be redirected." The submarine in the pen behind the wall made a sound, some deep hydraulic adjustment in the machinery of it, a low, resonant groan that moved through the concrete floor and up through the folding table and into the hands of everyone sitting at it. Then it was quiet again. "What do we do about Emily?" Aldridge said. His voice was level in the way that voices were level when the person using them was controlling something that wanted a very different expression. "If Carver realizes we're moving against her, the people holding my daughter have standing instructions." Elena had thought about this for most of the walk from Building 12 to Dock 7. It was the variable that could not be finessed, the human element that sat outside the logic of the evidence chain and required a different kind of solution. "The people holding Emily are not ideological actors," as she said. "They are contracted assets. They are being paid to maintain a specific condition and to execute a specific action if the condition changes in a specific way. They are not invested in the outcome beyond the contract." She paused. "Which means if the contract is interrupted before the trigger is activated, they have no motivation to execute the action." Aldridge looked at her. You can interrupt the contract. The correction layer that Carver has been using to manage your output runs through the administrative terminal in Building 12. That terminal has a session log that records every access event, every command, every outbound transmission. Webb pulled the session log before we left the facility. She looked at Webb. Tell him what you found. Webb had it ready. He had been running the analysis on his phone during the walk from Building 12, which she had noticed and not interrupted because the work was exactly what was needed. The terminal accessed the network communication channel that carries payment instructions to contracted assets in 4 instances over the past 8 months. The payment instructions run through a commercial routing system that the intelligence community uses for contractor payments in gray zone operations. I have the routing numbers. Aldridge understood before she said it. If you interrupt this payment channel, and he said, the contract defaults, the assets stand down. He looked at the table. They release her. They release her, or they request new authorization, which requires a communication we will be monitoring. Either way, she is no longer a controlled variable. Elena looked at him. It takes approximately 6 hours to process a payment interruption through the OIG's contractor finance review system. During those 6 hours, we need to move the evidence chain to the DODIG in a way that locks it from recall. And we need to do it before Carver realizes that the people in Building 12 tonight were not apprehended. Holt had been running in his own calculation. She could see it in the quality of his attention, the way his eyes moved slightly without focusing on anything in the room. The internal mapping of logistics and timing that was the cognitive signature of an operator planning under time pressure. The security team she sent to Building 12 is going to report the facility empty. That gives her maybe 2 hours before she adjusts her working theory about where we went. 1 hour and 40 minutes, Elena said. I know the base security team leader's reporting interval. He runs 15-minute cycles on a directed search. Holt looked at her. I memorized the base security protocols in my second week here, she said, all of them. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The specific facial motion of a man recalibrating an assessment that had already been revised several times upward. He stood from the table. Webb, payment interruption. Start now. He looked at Aldridge. Frank, help him. You know the contractor finance system better than anyone in this room, and we need it done in under an hour. Aldridge was already pulling his chair around to Webb's side of the table. Holt looked at Elena. The OIG filing, how long? 20 minutes to prepare the trigger complaint, 15 to transmit through the secure channel, 5 to receive the automated confirmation. She paused. The transmission has to go from a terminal outside Carver's access architecture. The submarine's communication system runs on sublant authority, Holt said. He looked toward the door that led to the pen. The duty officer is a lieutenant commander named Ferris. I've worked with him twice. He'll give me terminal access. He walked toward the door without waiting for acknowledgement. Elena sat down at the end of the folding table and opened the secure container and began to work. She worked the way she always worked when the pressure was highest, not faster but more precisely, stripping every action down to its essential components and executing each one completely before moving to the next. The trigger complaint needed to establish the evidentiary chain clearly enough that an OIG analyst seeing it for the first time would understand within 60 seconds what it was and what it connected to. It needed to reference the existing file in the repository without revealing how that file had been submitted to protect the source protocol that had kept it inaccessible for 3 years. She wrote. She did not look up. Behind her, she could hear Webb and Aldridge working through the payment interruption process in low voices. Aldridge walking Webb through the contractor finance system with the focused efficiency of a man who had been waiting months to do something useful with what he knew. Webb asked precise questions and received precise answers, and the work moved forward at the pace that competent people working toward a shared goal could sustain when the ordinary institutional friction had been removed. 15 minutes in, Aldridge said quietly, the routing is confirmed. The interruption request is in the system. 6 hours to process. Elena kept writing. At 18 minutes, she read back through the trigger complaint in full. It was complete. It was correct. It would do what it needed to do. Holt appeared in the doorway that led to the submarine pen. Terminal's ready. Ferris didn't ask questions. She picked up the document and followed him through. The pen was cavernous and dimly lit, the hull of the boat running the full length of the space, black and immense in the particular way that submarines were always alien, built for an environment that human beings were not designed for and reaching into that environment anyway. The duty officer's communication station was at the near end, a compact setup with hardened terminals and a direct satellite uplink that bypassed the base network entirely. She sat down, loaded the document, attached Webb's email chain and the authorization memo as supporting exhibits, clearly referenced and numbered within the body of the complaint, so that the file in the OIG repository would lock into its proper context the moment the trigger arrived. She reviewed it one final time. Then she transmitted. The progress bar ran for 11 seconds. The confirmation appeared. A case number, a timestamp, the automated notation that the file had been received, logged, and protected under OIG investigation protocol, inaccessible to modification or withdrawal from any source including the filing party. She looked at the screen for a moment. Then she stood up. Holt was standing behind her. He had been reading the document over her shoulder during the final review, and she had known he was there and had not said anything about it because there was nothing to say. He had been present in every part of this from the beginning of it, and this moment belonged to him as much as it belonged to her. "It's done," she said. He nodded. "Nothing more, nothing less." Carver's office called at 0417 hours. Elena was sitting at the folding table in the maintenance bay with a thermos of coffee the duty officer had produced without being asked, which was the kind of small institutional generosity she had always noticed more than people expected her to notice. Holt was on the phone with Ferris about base security rotation. Webb was asleep in a chair with his head against the wall, genuinely asleep. The hard and immediate sleep of a person who had been running on controlled adrenaline for days and had finally been given a few minutes where nothing was required of them. Aldridge was sitting with his elbows on the table and his hands folded and his eyes open, not focused on anything in the room. The posture of a man in the specific waiting that comes when you have done everything you can do and are now dependent on events outside your control. The call came to Elena's phone, base extension, Carver's outer office number. She let it ring twice, then she answered. Carver's voice had a quality she had not heard in it before. Not the measured control of the woman who had sat at her desk and admitted to deleting a record with the composure of someone confessing a calculated decision rather than a crime. This voice had the particular texture of someone who had received information they had not anticipated and had not yet fully integrated. "Miss Reeves," a pause. "I'm calling to inquire about your current location. The security sweep of Building 12 found the facility unoccupied." Elena said, "I think you should call the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, Admiral. They received a filing approximately 40 minutes ago that I believe you'll want to be briefed on." The silence on the line lasted 4 seconds. In Elena's experience, the silences that lasted exactly 4 seconds were the most informative. A 1-second silence was processing. A 2-second silence was assessment. A 3-second silence was the formation of a response. A 4-second silence was the moment when the person understood that the response they were forming was not going to be adequate to the situation and were deciding what to do about that understanding. "Ms. Reeves," Carver said, "the filing includes 37 photographs from the Kandahar compound, taken in March 2019. It includes a 4-year documentation trail connecting the authorization chain for the Gulf mission to your signature. It includes the contractor payment records from the Building 12 administrative terminal, demonstrating your management of the network communication channel." Elena's voice was level and unhurried. "The case number is already in the system. The file is locked. There is nothing administrative that can reach it." Another silence, shorter this time. "The contractor payment channel has been interrupted through the OIG's contractor finance review process. The assets holding Colonel Aldridge's daughter are operating on a defaulted contract as of approximately 1 hour ago. They have no authorization to proceed with any contingency action." She heard something change in the quality of the silence. Not movement, not sound, something subtler than both. The specific change that happened in a person's bearing when a calculation they had been running for years reached its terminal result, and the terminal result was not the one they had designed for. "You've been building towards this for 3 years," Carver said. It was not quite an accusation. It was the statement of someone who had underestimated the patience of the person across from them and was arriving at a full understanding of that underestimation. "I was in position," Elena said. "I just needed the other pieces." She ended the call. She set the phone on the table. The room was very still. Then Aldridge's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and his face did something that Elena would remember for a long time afterward, a slow dissolution of something that had been held in place by sustained force for 8 months, a relaxing of muscles around the eyes and jaw that looked almost like pain, except that it was the opposite of pain. It was the release of a weight that had been carried so long, the body had reorganized itself around the carrying and now had to relearn what it felt like to stand without it. He picked up the phone. He read the message. He set the phone down carefully, with the specific care of a person who did not trust themselves with objects in that particular moment. "She's safe," he said. His throat worked once. "A state trooper on I-95, north of Richmond. She's cold and frightened, but she's not hurt." He stopped. "She's asking for me." Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. But there was still something that had to happen first. something that had been part of the architecture of this operation from the night Aldridge sat down at that table and said, "I let it fire." He had not come to Dock 7 only to confess and receive information. He had come with something prepared, something he had been building for 8 months with the same patient method that Elena had used for 3 years, and which he had never told anyone about because telling anyone would have required trusting someone. And trust had been the one thing he could not afford to carry. He reached inside his jacket and placed a small device on the table. A recorder, compact, the kind used in legal depositions. He had been wearing it since he arrived. "Everything I've said in this room tonight," he said, "everything about the channel, the payment routing, the correction layer, the name." He looked at Elena. "It's clean, uninterrupted, admissible." She looked at the device. She looked at him. 8 months, he said. "I had one job and it wasn't feeding the network. That was the cover. The job was building the case from the inside, using myself as the instrument. I've been recording every contact, every instruction, every payment confirmation since the first week. I couldn't use any of it alone. One voice against an institution that had every incentive to discredit it." He paused. "I was waiting for the other direction." Webb was staring at the recorder. Holt was very still. Elena looked at Aldridge and understood, with the particular clarity of recognizing a method she had used herself, that what she was looking at was not a broken man who had been extorted into cooperation. What she was looking at was an operative who had spent 8 months in the deepest and most dangerous kind of cover there was. Cover that looked like betrayal. Cover that required him to absorb the weight of appearing to be the thing he was working to destroy, with no support, no handler, no institutional protection, and the life of his daughter as the cost of any mistake. She picked up the recorder. She added it to the evidence package. "We transmit the audio separately," she said. "Separate case file, separate exhibit number, separate confirmation." She looked at Aldridge. "It goes in before the investigation closes." He nodded once. There was nothing more to say. Outside the maintenance bay, the December base continued its nighttime operations without awareness of what had just been assembled inside this room. The submarine in the pen made its slow mechanical adjustments. The water moved against the hull. The lights at the security perimeter held their steady positions on the fence line. Elena picked up the secure container and went back to the submarine terminal. She transmitted the audio file at 0452 hours. The second confirmation arrived at 0457. 2 case files, 2 sets of evidence, 2 separate locks on the same truth, each one capable of holding the weight independently if the other was challenged. She returned to the maintenance bay and sat down and poured coffee from the thermos and did not look at anyone for a moment. And in that moment, she let herself feel, briefly and privately, the specific quality of relief that was not the absence of tension, but the resolution of it. The knowledge that something you had carried for years at significant cost had reached the place it was always meant to reach. Then she set the cup down and looked at Holt. "We're done here," she said. "The debriefings took 3 days. The OD Inspector General's office worked quickly, which was unusual for the OIG, but the nature of what had been filed and the seniority of the subject made the institutional machinery move at a different pace than it typically moved. Rear Admiral Susan Carver was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's preliminary phase. Her access credentials were suspended that same morning before her car left the parking structure. The network she had been managing for 3 years lost its correction layer and its payment channel simultaneously and began to disintegrate with the natural speed of a structure whose load-bearing element has been removed. Elena spent the first day in a conference room with 2 OIG investigators and a JAG officer. Walking through the evidence chain from beginning to end, she was thorough and she was precise, and she answered every question completely, and she did not perform the satisfaction she felt, because the satisfaction was a private thing and the room was not a private place. The OIG lead, a woman named Strauss, who had the sharp, unhurried efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this specific kind of filing, told Elena at the end of the day that the preliminary assessment confirmed the case would proceed at the highest classification level. Elena thanked her. She left the room and walked to the water and stood there for 10 minutes in the cold before going back to her quarters. Webb spent his first day in a separate conference room with a different team. His documentation of his brother's mission was entered into the formal record. The case was reopened. The specific things that James Webb had been denied, the official acknowledgement, the casualty notification, the military honors, the simple public recognition that he had existed and served and died in a place the government had sent him, were set in motion. The process was long and the bureaucracy was real. But the door that had been sealed for 4 years had been opened, and it could not be sealed again. On the second day, Aldridge was driven to Richmond. He met Emily at a hospital where she had been evaluated and cleared. The agents waited in the corridor. What happened in that room was between a father and his daughter and was not recorded or reported and did not need to be. Kowalski had taken the team off base for the duration of the debriefings, a reasonable precaution that also served to keep Diaz and Teller clear of the institutional machinery until it had processed what it needed to process. He sent a one-line message to Holt at the end of each day. Team good, standing by. That was enough. On the third day, Elena was called to a meeting with a subland admiral she had never met, a man named Hoagland, who was 60 years old and had the manner of someone who had served long enough to understand the difference between the institution and the people inside it and had made his peace with caring about both simultaneously. He had spent 32 years in naval service and had the specific steadiness that came not from never having doubted, but from having doubted thoroughly enough to arrive at something reliable on the other side. He asked her questions about Building 12, about the investigation, about what she had preserved and how and why. He asked her about the photographs, how she had decided to take them, what she had understood in the moment about what she was looking at, why she had chosen the repository she chose. She answered all of it without shaping the answers toward any particular impression she wanted to make. She had spent too long managing impressions in rooms like this one, and she was tired of the management. She gave him the plain version and let him do with it what he would do. At the end of the meeting, he said, "You've been a contractor here for 6 months." "Yes, sir." "And before that, CIA Special Activities." "Yes, sir." He looked at a folder on the desk. He looked at her. "There is a position here that does not appear on any organizational chart. It does not have a title that fits on a standard form. It involves analysis, and it involves operations, and it occasionally requires being the person in the room who sees the thing that everyone else is too positioned to see." He paused. "You interested?" Elena looked at him for a moment. "Send me the file," she said. She ran the next morning at 4:47, the same route, the same 41 steps to the first fence post, 93 to the corner with the floodlight, 217 to the water. December had deepened overnight, and the air coming off the bay was sharper than it had been. The kind of cold that clarified rather than numbed, that made the edges of things more readable and the distances more honest. She slowed to a walk at the waterfront and stood for a moment looking out. The bay was doing what it always did, moving, unhurried, not indifferent exactly, but larger than any individual event on its surface, carrying ships and weather and time with the same undifferentiating patience it had always carried them. She heard footsteps on the asphalt behind her. She knew the sound of them before she turned. She knew the specific weight and pace of them without needing to look. Holt stopped beside her. He did not explain why he was there at 4:47 in the morning at the end of the waterfront road. He did not need to. She did not ask. They stood side by side and looked at the bay together, and the silence between them was the comfortable silence of people who had been through something together that had the quality of a defining event and were now in the quiet on the other side of it. After a while, he said, "Kowalski wants to know if you're staying." "I'm staying." He nodded. She looked down at her left wrist. The tattoo. 8 marks arranged around the trident, each one a name she had carried for 3 years in a notebook in a fireproof lockbox under her bed. Carried because carrying was what you did when you could not yet do anything else. Carried until the moment arrived when the carrying could become something more than carrying. She thought about Aldridge and his daughter. The two of them in a hospital room in Richmond, no agents, no recorders, no institutional witness. Just a father who had spent 8 months in the darkest kind of work, and a daughter who had survived what had been done to her, in the particular quality of silence that existed between people who had been separated by danger and were now in the same room again, and did not yet have words for what that felt like. She thought about Webb, about James Webb, Petty Officer First Class, SEAL Team 5, killed in action in a place the government had since pretended did not exist. About the case file that was now open in a federal system where it could not be closed by a signature, and about the specific dignity of having your name attached to your service in the official record rather than erased from it. She thought about the 37 photographs she had taken on a camera she had not been authorized to use, in a compound she should have left before the situation required her to stay. 3 years in a repository. 3 years of sitting in a corner seat in Building 4 and running 41 steps to a fence post in the dark and knowing that the photographs existed and that their existence was not enough by itself, and that patience was not the same as inaction, and that the right moment was a real thing that arrived when the conditions aligned and not before. She pressed her thumb against the tattoo. 8 marks, 8 names. A private accounting made in ink on skin because some debts required a physical form, because carrying a thing in the body was different from carrying it in the mind, because the body remembered in ways that the mind could manage around but could not fully contain. She had paid the debt. Not all debts could be paid in kind, But she had done what she could do with what she had in the time she had to do it. And the people who needed to be safe were safe. And the people who had been denied a reckoning had their reckoning. And the thing that had been buried for 3 years was no longer buried. That was what the mark meant. That was what it had always meant. Not glory, not recognition, not the warm completion of a story that ends with everyone gathered in a room expressing their gratitude. Just the plain, stubborn, unglamorous work of not letting the wrong thing stand when you were the person who knew it was wrong and had the means to address it and the patience to wait for the moment when the address could hold. There was a kind of warrior that nobody wrote about in the histories, not the ones who charged the position or held the line or carried the medal home. The ones who carried the knowledge. The ones who sat in corner seats for 6 months and ran the perimeter before sunrise and put things in places where they would be safe, who understood that the right moment mattered more than the first opportunity, and who had the discipline not to spend what they had before the moment was right. Those warriors were invisible by design. Their victories did not look like victories from the outside. They looked like bureaucratic processes and document filings and conversations in concrete rooms past midnight. But the people who were safe because of those conversations were real. And the difference between those outcomes and the other possible outcomes was the patience of the specific person who had chosen not to flinch at invisibility. Holt said quietly, "Hoagland's offer. You're going to take it." It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The team deploys in 11 days. "I know. The intelligence product for the deployment window has gaps I'd like filled before we go wheels up. You'll have it in 4 days." He looked at her. The expression on his face was the one she had first seen in the briefing room when he asked her to roll up her left sleeve, the complicated one that had taken her days to fully read. She read it now without difficulty. It was the expression of a man who had been carrying a debt for 3 years and had finally been given a way to carry it differently. Not erased, transformed, from a weight into something more like a foundation. He extended his hand. She took it. Firm, brief. The kind of handshake that did not perform what it meant, but simply meant it. He turned and walked back the way he had come. She turned and looked at the water one more time, and the bay went on doing what it had always done, moving without hurry, carrying everything placed on its surface with the same undifferentiating patience it had carried everything else. And the December light was coming up now over the eastern horizon, thin and gray and entirely without drama. And it was enough. She was about to head back when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. No caller ID. Routed through a channel she recognized from a previous life as a method of contact used exclusively by people who had no official existence and needed it to stay that way. She looked at the screen for a moment. Then she answered. The voice on the line was measured and unhurried and entirely without effect. The voice of someone who communicated only in precisely what was necessary and nothing more. "Ms. Reeves, the authorization chain on Carver's laptop had 19 signatures. Carver was 1. The OIG filing covers 3. A pause. There are 16 others. We've been watching them for some time. We've been watching you for considerably longer." Another pause, briefer. "We'd like to offer you a different kind of mandate and resources that don't appear on any organizational chart." Elena looked at the bay. She thought about the notebook in the fireproof lockbox. 19 names on a chain that had cost 3 Afghan intelligence officers their lives, had cost James Webb his, had cost Aldridge 8 months that neither he nor Emily would ever recover. She had known about the 19. She had always known. She had filed for 3 and waited for the moment when the others could be addressed. The moment, it seemed, had a different shape than she had anticipated. "Send me the names," she said. She put the phone in her pocket. She had work to do. She ran. If you've ever served or loved someone who did, you know that the real mission doesn't always end when the helicopter lifts off. Elena never asked for recognition. She just carried what she knew and waited for the right moment. 3 years is a long time to stay quiet when you're holding the truth. What hit you hardest in this story? The moment she turned off the lights? The phone call at 0417? Or something else? Drop it in the comments. I read every one. And if stories like this are your kind of thing, subscribe. There's more where this came from.